just want to talk about a little bit more about sort of the policy and at the federal level, and sort of how we try to first focus, take research that comes from academia and other organizations. To give a quick shout out to our friends at the National Center for Children in Poverty and Dr. Simmons. We use a lot of the work from NCCP and a lot of the groups here in this room, and we try to form coalitions to try to move policy based on there's evidence based and there's research behind as much as we can. So I first want to start with sort of this kind of where kind of children stand at the federal level, just because it gives sort of some context. And our fundamental premise is that you're trying to raise people out of poverty. There's the money aspect of it. So money does matter, and so are we making fundamental investments in children and families? And what we found is we do a publication every year called Children's Budget, and we analyze the federal budget and take out all the programs that have impact on children. What you can see is that kids are about a quarter of the population, but targeted investments to kids are now less than 8% of all federal spending. So, what's important to note is about 2/3 of all spending on kids are actually made at the state and local level, but we would argue that this number should be way higher if we really want to make a huge difference in sort of the lives of kids. The other kind of fundamental problem is that this number has been going down. So it starts off with a bad number, and it's been heading in the wrong direction. And you can see over the past 6 years, the share of overall spending for kids has actually dropped by over 7%. And the future does not look good. This comes from a report by the Urban Institute. That they have a report called Kid Share that's sort of a companion. Our report's sort of a companion to theirs, let me put it that way. They had their report out first. And what they do, they also do a projection of 10 years in the future. So if you look at current policies and project them 10 years forward in Congress, what you see is that children would only get about 2% of all new spending over the whole next decade. And if you take health out of the equation, that number's negative. So Medicaid is the reason why there's even a positive number. If not for Medicaid, that number is actually negative. And you can see that if you watched the joint address last night by President Trump, something to note here is, so this projection is under current policies. Well, he's talking about doing a major increase here in defense. So if that goes up, and he's also promised to not touch Social Security and Medicare. So, and also talked about doing investments in sort of infrastructure. So if those things all go up, and he's talking about also cutting the deficit, we're very concerned about what that means for the children's programs. So will that number actually turn negative in a very profound way? And so we're working on something. We have a coalition of advocacy groups, some of you in this room are part of, the Children's Budget Coalition, to go to Congress and really make the point that children need a targeted, focused investment. And so hopefully we can kind of not see this go even, go downward even worse than it is, but actually start trying to turn the dial back up. With respect to child poverty in America, you guys know these numbers, but this is stuff we, from the CCP and the Census Bureau data. And what I think is important to note here is that children are 69% more likely to live in poverty than adults. And we need to not only address child poverty in kids overall, but we also need to deal with racial equity issues. And the blue line is kids below 100% of poverty, and the red is kids below 200% of poverty. And I think that you look at sort of that data, and we talk to people on the Hill about these numbers, and people are shocked. And it's an issue that is a national crisis, and yet do you ever hear anybody in Congress talk about it? And so one of the things we're really trying to do, and another thing we've done, is we're working with a lot of people in this room on a child poverty action group. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but to really sort of change the conversation and create a conversation about child poverty on Capitol Hill and in the administration. One of the big barriers, I think, is that people think that issues around poverty are intractable. And so it's really great the work that the folks in Utah are doing and in academia around sort of solutions and prevention research. And so people, when we, you kind of have to come at people who think that it's intractable. There's nothing we can do about it. But we know for a fact that yes, we can. And so, oops, I did too many at once. What this chart shows is the gray line's not as dark as it should be, but the gray line is seniors and the blue line is kids. So the poverty rate for senior citizens used to be much higher than children. And in the 60s, we did things like we expanded Social Security, we passed Medicare, and those have had huge, profound impacts. So we know if you make investments in a population, you can really change the poverty levels, and you can see the significant drop in poverty level among senior citizens compared to where we sort of headed with kids. And what we've done in counter for children is TANF. We actually divested in kids, and so the average the average spending on an inflation-adjusted basis when TANF was converted from AFDC, which was an entitlement, to a block grant under TANF, it's like about a third of the value that the funding has gone away. Plus, a lot of the funds have been diverted to things that have nothing to do with child poverty. And so, the consequence is we've actually divested in kids while we've made investments in senior citizens. So, we do know what to do. We're just not doing it for children. I will also then point to the UK. So, in I believe it was in 1999, the Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, made a promise to cut child poverty in half in 10 years. And it was actually a shock to everybody in his administration. He didn't run this by people, and made this commitment to do something about this issue. You can see their poverty rate their absolute poverty rate was much higher than that in the U.S. And so they engaged in this huge campaign to cut child poverty in half. And what you can see is they actually achieved it before the 10 years. They actually achieved it by I think it was about year 7. And so their poverty rate has dropped dramatically because they made a focused investments, and they were paid attention to it, and they did evaluation of how things were going. So every year they come back and how are we doing? And in contrast, the United States' poverty rate has just gone up and down based upon the economic cycles, and not so much. There has not been a focus. You can see, consequently, our child poverty rate is now much higher than theirs. So one of the things that they did, and this is us looking at, what lessons can we learn from the UK? And they did sort of 3 major things. One was promoting work and making work pay. They actually established a national minimum wage. They didn't even have one. Established one that's much higher than ours. They created a working families tax credit, reduced payroll taxes for low-income workers. So they did tax cuts for poor people. They also raised incomes for families. They created a new child benefit, a new child tax credit for low-income families, and then they created these child trust funds, sort of like the concept of baby bonds that people have talked about here in this country. And then last, they made target investments in kids, so investing in early childhood. They expanded their Sure Start programs, which is like our Head Start. They also expanded a lot of funding to their K-12 education system. So where is child poverty in this country? And you can see, you all know this. It's southwest, southeast, and in pockets, and like in the Dakotas, that's Native American reservations, for example. But also, there's sort of a fallacy that this is sort of a urban issue in America. There's definitely poverty issues in urban areas, but it's also a huge rural problem in this country. And so, so you look at that chart, and then you also look at the Annie Casey Foundation does a kids count report every year looking at child well-being, and they look at various indices of how are kids faring across categories. And what you see is here's the states, the bottom third states in the country. Does that chart look a little bit like that chart? I think so. And so this, I think, points to the issues of, child poverty is one of those issues that is cross-cutting. The impacts of child poverty is on every aspect of a child's life, and it results in sort of negative consequences for kids in their health, their education, their early childhood, all the indices that the Annie Casey Foundation looks to to determine whether how kids are faring in their child well-being. What you can also see is that those parts of the country don't make the investments in kids that other regions do. And so this is looking at spending on K-12 programs. And then this chart looks at medical assistance and income support spending. As you can see, this is from the Rockefeller Institute. And this shows that those areas make significantly lower investments. So one of the questions is, well, maybe it's just they're poor areas. And so they don't have resources to be making the investments necessary for kids. In part, that's true. And that would speak to why there also needs to be sort of a federal support investments in kids to sort of equalize. But the fact of the matter is, it's not entirely true. It's partially true, but not entirely true. So the Education Law Center in Connecticut has an investment indices that they look at in sort of an effort index. And they looked at that, and they do it by state. And what you can see is these states, not only are they poor in not making investments, but they actually don't try as much as the national average. You can see 7 Fs, for example, in terms of the grade they receive. So there's wide variation. So like West Virginia makes lower than average investments in its educational system, but they actually get an A on effort, because when they do the adjustment based upon how much resources do they have to make, they actually do a fairly good job in terms of effort. They still invest less than the national average, but then other areas they have lower resources and also don't make effort, which creates that enormous gap. Bill Fry is a demographer, and he talks about the demographic reality is that America's youth, and more specifically its racial minority youth, is its future and why we need to be investing in kids. So anyway, so beating a dead horse on why investing in money matters in kids. So what are we doing about it, and what are some of the barriers in terms of creating an agenda? Some of it is making sure we have the evidence at hand. And so the National Academy of Sciences is doing a follow-up report on child poverty, which we're very excited about, and looking forward to that process. And I think you guys are having your first convene next month, right, of that committee?
I think they just put the committee together. I wouldn't want to say because I don't know.
Okay.
So I know the committee has been formed, and I just don't know the date of the first meeting.
Yeah,
so
that,
you could very well be right.
Yeah, so I know that's coming up, which is very exciting. Congresswomen Lee and Roy Allard passed an appropriations lineup, appropriation for it with Chairman Cole. So it was a bipartisan initiative to create this child poverty report with the National Academy. So we're very excited about that. We also we co-chair like the Home Visiting Coalition, and we work with the models and also advocates to try to bring some of that evidence base to attention to Capitol Hill, so that they will make those investments in kids. So what are some of the barriers we have? Sort of there's societal barriers. So we have this issue of the racial generation gap. We also have this issue that people, you talked about it, Dr. Gibbs, is sort of this idea of the parent bubble. So it's not the role of government to be thinking about it, to be making investments in families. That's the role of the parent. So I agree that sort of maintaining the focus on children is important in terms of sort of getting past that. Public education barriers. One of the things we found in research is if you ask people specifically what one of their top issues is, and you ask children, are children an important issue to you, and you actually pit them against other areas, people will say yes. But if you ask people just sort of generally, what are your top issues, kids won't come up. So there's a barrier. Our pollster who we worked with on this and on the focus groups talked about kids being a scratch and sniff issue, that people don't necessarily think about kids in the top context of public policy, but when you then sort of bring it to their attention, they're very energized. And so how do we sort of bridge this education problem where people don't think about kids and the impact on public policy? They think about it in terms of their local school, parks even, but then they don't really think about child nutrition programs are actually funded at the federal government. So then, but if you ask them, do you care about child nutrition? Yes, but they will not make it a priority when they vote and things like that, and politicians know that. And so sort of overcoming that barrier. And then also with the media, one of our big frustrations, I think, so many of you may agree with this, I would imagine, is that when we talk to the media, people think of kids as sort of soft news. That's something to put on the style section, and it's, kids have every right to be on the front page of the newspaper and their problems as anyone else. And so how do we sort of overcome that barrier with the media that kids are sort of a nice little touchy-feely thing to put on back sections of the paper, and really get them to front kids' issues as, and you can look at it right now in this healthcare debate. What are we talking about? We're talking about the Affordable Care Act, which affects kids but not as much as other populations. We're talking about Medicaid, impacts kids tremendously. Medicare, not so much. But the Children's Health Insurance Program, I don't know if anyone's heard that even mentioned. It must be reauthorized this year, and it affects 8 million kids. So we're on Capitol Hill, we bring it up, and people go, oh yeah, because of all these other conversations. So we're, how do we move kids from being an afterthought to being sort of a primary issue that people think about? Then there's sort of that kids advocacy barriers, which is, yes, kids don't vote, they don't give campaign contributions, so one of the things we need to do is to create a sort of, basically a movement for kids, but also includes grassroots support that we need to sort of generate, and also sort of break down the silos. All the kids groups are in, very focused issue areas, and work so that we support one another's issue across areas. So the child welfare people need to help the child nutrition people, who need to help the child welfare people, et cetera. So those are areas I think that will make a big difference. So what are we working on right now? Certainly a lot of playing defense. So an example is sort of, we've had this enormous success story in child advocacy, which is the uninsured rate for kids. In 1997, when the Children's Health Insurance Program passed, was about 15%. It's now below 5%. So the uninsured rate for kids has dropped by 68% in this country. Nobody knows that story. And so as Congress is talking about how they're going to change this and this, we keep saying if you do that, it affects kids, and they're unaware. So we're trying to get to this mantra of do no harm. So as you're thinking about policies of changing things like pre-existing condition changes or Medicaid, that you do no harm to kids. So really it's kind of raising the kid angles in these debates. I've already talked about sort of the issues around the budget, but we're very concerned about people talking about increases in other areas, meaning that we actually go down or negative. And would be the one bar that might go negative unless we have a concerted effort to protect investments in kids. We should not be getting 2%. Kids are a quarter of the population. It should be actually going up, not the other way. So we're trying to talk to both Congress and the administration about those issues. So not to leave people depressed about where things are, here's the good news. The good news is the American people agree with us. We asked sort of this issue around questions around the American dream. Do you believe in the American dream? People say absolutely. We believe that as a nation, every generation should, stand on the shoulders of the last generation. We asked people, are you confident that the next generation will fare better than the past? And people, 2/3 of Americans said no. And if you look at that, Republicans, 80% of Republicans said no. So this is a bipartisan issue. People are very concerned about the future of our nation's kids and where things are heading. We also asked a series of questions on sort of some generic policy, well, not generic policy, but some policies that we were looking at of importance to kids. So we asked things like, do you think we should, we have a campaign to cut child poverty in half. We asked people if they supported that, extending child tax credits, adopting a children's budget, adopting a bipartisan children's commission to look at issues kind of like the Intergenerational Commission in Utah. And what you can see is overwhelming support among the public. You have enormous support, and the intensity level is what's important, because that means people are extremely interested. And our pollster was laughing because they said, adopting a children's budget, you had like 51, more than half of Americans go, yes, I'm extremely excited about that. And they thought they would be more like 10%, because how do you get extremely excited about a processing thing? But this does show that there's strong support. And the other thing I'll note is this issue around cut child poverty in half. Our pollster said the 82% is awesome, but what's amazing about that is we live in this very cynical time, and that you can ask almost any question right now, and 25% of Americans will say no to anything. Apple pie, whatever it is, like baseball, whatever. People are very cynical, and so she's like, you're getting half of the people who hate everything. So, these issues do resonate with voters. So just to sort of sum up, how do we move a pathway forward? I do believe there's a bipartisan approach that we can garner in terms of making children a priority, reaching out across generations, sort of breaking the racial generation gap. You can look at sort of the polling in the last election, and there's definitely a generational gap, and it's also racial. How do we convince older white Americans to be making investments in younger, a generation of kids that are 50-50 in terms of race? And so, and that is critical to our future. And so really getting the older generations to understand that and make those investments, embracing diversity and changing demographics, and also reaching out to our strongest allies in polling, and building a new generation of champions for kids. Here's some things that we were talking to. So like we're trying to pass a child poverty target. Here, let me go to that first. We're working on a child poverty target bill to mirror what the UK did. And the Child Poverty Reduction Act was introduced in 2015. It's about to be reintroduced in the House and Senate. And what the bill would do is basically create this target and a sort of ongoing cycle of information about how we're faring in terms of meeting the goals of cutting child poverty in this country in half in 10 years and eliminating it in 20. And then back to sort of other issues that we've talked to people at the state and local level about. We had a really good meeting with like the National League of Cities where they talked about, the mayor sort of came up and brainstormed a bunch of these issues, things that you can do at the local level, things that I'm really looking forward to the reports that come out in Utah around the local areas about what are the various components. So at the federal level, we have the ability to sort of change the tax code and things like that and get massive amounts. Local areas don't have that, but they're more in touch with these kinds of things. And so what are the different strategies and policy changes that are necessary to sort of deal with this issue and tackle child poverty? So here were some of the things that the mayors came up with. And then I would note that this happened like this, I think this, like earlier this week, is Assemblywoman from California, Assemblywoman Burke, introduced a bill to cut the child poverty rate in half in California. So I'm excited that we're seeing some movement on these issues at the state level, but also at the federal level, and how do we, and at the local level, and how do we continue to build toward really changing this dynamic in what I would argue is a fundamental crisis in America that has unfortunately been ignored for too long. So thank you.